How could a single enemy aircraft, lying silent on a cold European airfield, tell seasoned German engineers that the course of the war was beginning to shift? It was the autumn of 1942, and the air war over Europe had entered a brutal new phase. The location was Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secretive aircraft test center north of Berlin. Officially known as Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, it was where Germany brought captured enemy aircraft to be torn apart, analyzed, and exploited. Nothing arrived here by accident. Every rivet mattered. Every wire was questioned. And now, sitting intact on the tarmac, was something the Germans had desperately wanted their hands on: an American Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The aircraft had force-landed weeks earlier in occupied France after sustaining heavy damage during a daylight bombing raid over Rouen. The bomber, believed by historians to be a B-17F model from the 91st Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, had been hit by flak over the target area and then mauled by Messerschmitt Bf-109s during the withdrawal. 2 engines were failing. Oxygen lines were severed. Fuel was leaking. Against impossible odds, the American crew had limped south, crossing nearly 300 miles of hostile territory before making a controlled crash landing near Chartres. The crew burned sensitive documents and sabotage charges before being captured by Wehrmacht ground troops. But the aircraft itself, remarkably, was still largely intact. And that made it priceless. Within days, Luftwaffe recovery units dismantled the bomber, loaded it onto rail cars, and shipped it under heavy guard to Rechlin. The order had come directly from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's office. "Bring it to me whole," the message said. Little did they know what that aircraft would reveal. At Rechlin, the responsibility for evaluating the bomber fell to a team of senior engineers and test officers, many veterans of Germany's own aircraft development programs. Among them were specialists who had worked on the Heinkel He-111, the Junkers Ju-88, and even the cutting-edge Focke-Wulf FW-190. These were not men easily impressed. They believed German engineering was the finest in the world: precise, elegant, optimized. American designs, they assumed, were crude, overbuilt, wasteful. As one Luftwaffe technical officer later recalled after the war, "We expected a flying barn. What we found was something far more dangerous." The inspection began at 800 hours on a gray, overcast morning. The smell of cold metal and hydraulic fluid hung in the air as engineers climbed over the bomber with notebooks, calipers, and cameras. They started with the obvious: the size. At over 74 feet in length with a 103-foot wingspan, the B-17 dwarfed many German bombers. Its 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines looked massive, air-cooled, rugged, and unrefined by German standards. One engineer reportedly scoffed. "Too heavy," he muttered. "It should never fly." Then they began opening the panels. What they found inside made the room go quiet. The first shock was redundancy. Electrical wiring ran in multiple, separated paths. Hydraulic systems were doubled, and in some cases tripled. Control cables were routed so that a single shell hit would not sever them all at once. This was not elegance. This was survival. German aircraft design philosophy emphasized performance: lighter frames, tighter tolerances, fewer backups. If something failed, the aircraft was expected to be fast enough to escape, or the pilot skilled enough to compensate. The B-17 made a different assumption. It assumed it would be hit, and it was built accordingly. As engineers moved deeper into the fuselage, they began counting armor plates. Around the cockpit, behind the pilots, around the radio room, protecting ammunition boxes. Then they reached the gun positions. The nose-mounted 50 caliber Browning machine guns were unlike anything the Luftwaffe typically faced. German bombers carried lighter defensive weapons. Fighters relied on offense, not defense. The B-17 bristled with firepower. Up to 13 heavy machine guns, firing a round capable of tearing through aircraft structures at hundreds of meters. One German ballistics expert reportedly ran his fingers along the thick steel of the gun mounts and shook his head. "This is not a bomber," he said quietly. "This is a fortress." The phrase stuck. By midday, around 1300 hours, the engineers had reached what would become the most disturbing discovery of all: the damage assessment. They traced flak holes through the wings, shrapnel scars across the fuselage, entire sections where aluminum skin had been ripped away. By German calculations, the aircraft should have broken apart over France. It hadn't. Structural members were bent, but not failed. Load-bearing spars showed stress fractures, yet continued to hold. The aircraft had flown for hours in a condition that, by Luftwaffe standards, was catastrophic. One senior structural engineer reportedly said, "If this were one of ours, it would have fallen out of the sky." Fear gripped the room. Not panic, but something colder: recognition. Because what this meant was terrifyingly clear. If American bombers could absorb this level of punishment and still return home, if crews could be replaced faster than aircraft could be destroyed, if factories could build machines like this in quantity, then the air war Germany was fighting could not be won by skill alone. And this was only the beginning. What they had not yet examined, the manufacturing techniques, the interchangeable parts, the ease of repair, would deepen that realization even further. For now, the engineers stood in silence inside the wounded bomber, surrounded by twisted metal and bullet holes, staring at proof that the enemy was fighting a different kind of war. A war of endurance, a war of production, a war Germany was not prepared for. By 1500 hours, the engineers moved from the exterior and structural inspection to what truly mattered: the inside of the aircraft. Panels were removed, floor plates lifted, wiring looms exposed. What they found contradicted nearly everything the Luftwaffe believed about aircraft construction. Inside the B-17's fuselage, nothing was elegant, nothing was minimal. Instead, it was deliberate, thick, redundant, almost crude, yet brutally effective. German engineer Oberingenieur Karl-Heinz Müller, a specialist in aircraft survivability, took careful notes as technicians traced electrical circuits. Each system, radio, navigation, bomb release, had backups. In some cases, a failure would simply reroute power automatically. No pilot intervention required. That detail alone disturbed Müller deeply. German aircraft relied heavily on pilot skill under pressure. In combat, failures were expected to be managed manually, often while under fire. The American design assumed the crew might be wounded, exhausted, or partially incapacitated. The machine would compensate. As they moved forward into the cockpit, engineers examined the control layout. The instrumentation was simple, clearly labeled, standardized across models. Gauges were large, readable even in smoke or darkness. One engineer muttered bitterly, "This is made for farmers." But another corrected him. "No," he said, "this is made for replacement pilots." That realization cut deeper than any armor plate, because it meant the United States did not depend on elite aviators. It depended on systems, on training pipelines, on quantity. And quantity was something Germany could not match. At 1630 hours, attention turned to the bomb bay. The doors, operated by robust electric motors, were designed to open even if damaged. The racks were standardized. The release mechanisms were forgiving, tolerant of dirt, ice, or deformation. German bombers, by contrast, often used more delicate systems, efficient when new, unforgiving when damaged. Here again, the B-17 assumed it would be hit. One Luftwaffe test officer recorded in his report, "The American aircraft is built not to avoid damage, but to endure it." As daylight faded outside the hangar, engineers descended into the most infamous section of the aircraft, the ball turret. Suspended beneath the fuselage, the Sperry-manufactured turret was compact, armored, and horrifyingly clever. 250 caliber Brownings were mounted in a powered sphere that could rotate and elevate smoothly, even when damaged. German fighters attacking from below had previously considered this a blind spot. It was not. Measurements showed that the turret could track targets with surprising speed. The gunner, curled inside in a fetal position, was vulnerable, yes. But the turret itself was protected by armor and redundancy. One engineer stared at the turret mechanism in silence. "Who volunteers for this position?" he finally asked. The answer, young Americans barely out of training, cycling in endless numbers, was something he did not want to hear. By 1900 hours, the hangar lights were switched on. Cigarette smoke filled the air. The inspection continued, despite fatigue. Now came the moment that would haunt German aviation planners long after the war: interchangeability. Technicians began removing parts, pumps, valves, fittings, and comparing them with documentation recovered from the aircraft. Many components were clearly mass-produced. Tolerances were loose by German standards, yet functional. A part removed from one engine mount could fit another. Components could be swapped without custom machining. This was industrial warfare. Germany prided itself on precision engineering. Each aircraft was closer to a handcrafted instrument. Repairs often required skilled labor and time. The B-17 did not. It could be repaired in the field, quickly, by mechanics with limited training. One engineer reportedly slammed his notebook shut. "They are building aircraft the way we build trucks," he said. "And they are building more of them." At 2100 hours, a briefing was held in an adjacent room. Senior Luftwaffe officers joined the engineers. Charts were displayed, observations summarized. The room was quiet. Someone asked the question no one wanted to answer. How many of these can they build? No one knew the exact number. But intelligence estimates suggested American production was accelerating, monthly output already exceeding German bomber losses. And this aircraft, the B-17, was not even their newest model. There were rumors of improved versions, better armor, more guns, longer range, and worse still, there were whispers of an entirely new bomber in development. The engineers exchanged glances. What they had seen that day was not just an aircraft. It was a warning. Outside, the bomber sat silently under the hangar lights, its torn skin revealing the strength beneath. German engineers had expected to learn how to defeat it. Instead, they had learned something far more unsettling: that the war in the air was no longer a contest of pilots versus pilots. It was a contest of factories versus factories, and Germany was falling behind. Little did they know that within months, formations of hundreds, then thousands of these aircraft would darken the skies over the Reich itself. What happened next would become legendary. The next morning, 22nd October 1942, the mood at Rechlin was markedly different. Gone was the curiosity. Gone was the arrogance. What remained was calculation. At 700 hours, senior Luftwaffe planners, engineers, and intelligence officers reconvened in a briefing hall adjacent to the hangars. Coffee sat untouched. Maps of Europe covered the walls. Production charts were pinned beside aerial reconnaissance photographs of American factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and Wichita. The B-17 inspection reports lay open on the table. Each page told the same story. The aircraft was not exceptional because it was fast. It was not exceptional because it was elegant. It was exceptional because it could be replaced. Oberst Edgar Peterson, a Luftwaffe technical liaison officer, ran the numbers aloud. "At current interception rates," he said, tapping the chalkboard, "we must destroy at least 30% of attacking bombers per mission to stop sustained operations." He paused. "Our fighters are achieving perhaps 5 to 8%. Silence followed. German fighter pilots were among the best in the world. Men like Hauptmann Günther Rall and Oberst Adolf Galland had racked up dozens of kills. But even aces could not be everywhere at once. And the B-17 was designed to exploit that fact. By 0900 hours, intelligence officers presented updated estimates. American aircraft production, once dismissed as exaggerated propaganda, was real. In 1941, the United States had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. In 1942, that number was approaching 48,000 and rising. One officer muttered, "That is not production. That is mobilization." The engineers now explained what they had seen inside the bomber. This time not as technicians, but as witnesses. They described the wiring, the armor, the ease of repair, the interchangeable parts. They explained that the B-17 did not require elite mechanics. It did not require perfect conditions. It did not even require perfect pilots. It required time. Time Germany no longer had, because every damaged bomber that limped home could be repaired. Every lost crew could be replaced. Every failed mission could be flown again, tomorrow. German losses could not. By 1100 hours, the discussion turned grim. "How do we stop this?" someone asked. The answers were unsatisfying. More fighters, but fuel was scarce. Better intercept tactics. But training took time. Heavier guns. But development lagged behind deployment. Someone suggested attacking factories directly. Another officer shook his head. "They are an ocean away." At 1300 hours, Göring's representative arrived to collect the findings. The Reichsmarschall himself would not attend. He had grown increasingly detached from technical reality. But the message sent to Berlin was clear. The B-17 represented a fundamental shift, not a better bomber, a better system. That afternoon, the captured aircraft was moved again, this time for live testing. German pilots flew it, fired its guns, simulated damage. They tried to break it. They failed. Reports noted that even with one engine shut down, the bomber remained controllable. With severe control surface damage, it could still be flown. With sections of fuselage compromised, it did not catastrophically fail. By 1700 hours, one test pilot reportedly said, "I would not want to meet a formation of these head-on." And that was before escort fighters entered the equation. As dusk fell, one of the senior engineers remained behind in the hangar. He stood alone beneath the bomber, running a hand along the scarred aluminum skin. Fear gripped him, not fear of death, but of inevitability, because he understood something most German leaders still refused to accept. Wars were no longer decided by brilliance alone. They were decided by systems that could absorb loss and keep moving. The B-17 was proof, and it was coming in numbers Germany could not stop. For now, the bomber was just one aircraft under German control. But soon, thousands like it would cross the channel daily. And the skies over Germany would never be the same. What happened next would become legendary. By early 1943, the fears born inside the hangars at Rechlin began to materialize. At first, it was gradual. Then, it became relentless. On 27th of January 1943, the Luftwaffe's worst expectations took physical form in the skies over Wilhelmshaven. For the first time, the United States Army Air Forces launched a large-scale daylight bombing raid directly against Germany itself. More than 90 B-17 flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force, including aircraft from the 91st, 303rd, and 305th bomb groups, crossed the North Sea in tight combat boxes. They came exactly as the engineers had warned. High altitude, mutually supporting formations, defensive fire overlapping in every direction. German radar stations picked them up early. Scrambles were ordered. Bf-109s and Fw-190s clawed for altitude in the bitter winter air. But when the interceptors finally reached the bombers, just after 1200 hours, they found something deeply unsettling. The fortresses did not break. Pilots reported streams of .50 caliber fire reaching out hundreds of meters. Attacking head-on, the preferred Luftwaffe tactic, had become lethal. Closing speeds exceeded 600 miles per hour, leaving only seconds to aim. And even when hits were scored, the bombers kept flying. One German pilot later recalled, "I saw pieces fall away. Smoke poured from an engine, and still it held formation." exactly as predicted. Over the next weeks, the pattern repeated. Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, Vegesac. Bombers arrived damaged, returned damaged, and returned again. The Luftwaffe began calling certain aircraft zombie fortresses, machines that should have died, but didn't. Engineers at frontline airfields examined wreckage pulled from crash sites. They recognized the same features they had seen at Rechlin: redundant systems, overbuilt structures, battle damage that would have destroyed German aircraft outright. By March 1943, the strain was visible. Fighter units flew multiple sorties per day. Experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages limited training hours. New pilots arrived with fewer than 150 flight hours, some with barely half that. Meanwhile, American bomber losses, while heavy, were sustainable. Factories replaced aircraft. Training pipelines replaced crews. The engineers' calculations were becoming reality. And then came Schweinfurt. On 17 August 1943, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Double Strike, targeting the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft plants at Regensburg. Over 370 B-17s crossed into Germany. This was the crisis the Luftwaffe had feared. Fighters attacked relentlessly. Rockets were fired. Cannons tore into formations. The sky was filled with contrails, smoke, and falling aircraft. For hours, from 1,000 to nearly 1,600 hours, the air battle raged. German pilots scored victories, but they could not stop the bombers. Dozens of B-17s returned with gaping holes in their wings. Some landed with entire sections of tail missing. One bomber famously landed with its nose almost completely destroyed, the navigator killed at his station. The aircraft still flew. On the ground, German analysts counted the damage. They also counted the bombers that came back. And the number was enough. Enough to continue. Enough to return. Enough to prove that what the engineers had seen months earlier was no anomaly. It was doctrine. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, reports from Rechlin were pulled from archives and reread. Too late. The truth was now undeniable. Germany was fighting an enemy whose strength lay not in perfection, but in endurance. And the flying fortress was the embodiment of that truth. The war was turning, not with a single battle, but with every bomber that survived and flew again. What happened next would become legendary. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was no longer asking if the American bomber offensive could be stopped. It was asking how long Germany could endure it. The skies over the Reich had become a battlefield measured not in miles, but in minutes. At 0800 hours, radar stations along the Dutch coast would light up. By 0900, fighter wings scrambled. By 1000, contrails stretched across the sky like scars. And always, the B-17s came on. What the German engineers at Rechlin had foreseen was now impossible to ignore. The bomber formations were growing larger, tighter, and better protected. But the true turning point arrived not with the bombers themselves. It arrived with their escorts. On 4 December 1943, Luftwaffe pilots climbing to intercept a large formation over Frankfurt noticed something deeply unsettling. The fighters stayed with the bombers, all the way in, all the way out. These were not the short-range P-47 Thunderbolts they had learned to avoid. These were P-51 Mustangs, newly equipped with drop tanks, flown by pilots of the 354th Fighter Group. For the first time, the B-17s were no longer alone. The implications were catastrophic. German fighters could no longer wait until escorts turned back. There was no safe window, no moment of opportunity. Engagements turned into running battles stretching hundreds of miles. Losses mounted. Experienced pilots, men with years of combat, were shot down by fresh Americans flying aircraft designed with the same philosophy as the Flying Fortress: rugged, replaceable, effective. Back at Rechlin, engineers watched these developments with grim recognition. The system they had seen inside the B-17 was now being mirrored across the entire American air arm. Standardization, redundancy, mass production. Germany could not adapt fast enough. By January 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was bleeding to death. Fuel shortages grounded units. Training hours dropped below 100 hours for new pilots. Aircraft sat idle for lack of spare parts that could not be interchanged. Meanwhile, American crews flew again and again. Then came Big Week. From 20 to 25 February 1944, the USAAF launched Operation Argument, a coordinated assault against German aircraft production. Over 3,500 bomber sorties were flown. The irony was brutal. Germany was now losing the industrial war because of the very system the engineers had identified inside the B-17. Factories burned, assembly lines stopped. Skilled workers were killed or dispersed. And still, the bombers came. One former Luftwaffe engineer later wrote after the war, "When we inspected the Flying Fortress, we believed we were studying a weapon. In truth, we were studying our defeat." By June 1944, the airspace over Normandy belonged to the Allies. On 6 June, as thousands of aircraft supported the D-Day landings, there was no longer any doubt. The war had turned, not because of a single aircraft, but because of what that aircraft represented. A nation fighting with machines designed not for brilliance, but for inevitability. The B-17 Flying Fortress continued flying missions until the very end. By war's end, over 12,700 had been built. Tens of thousands of aircrew served aboard them. More than 4,700 were lost in combat. But they had done their job. They had proven the engineers right. The inspection at Rechlin never became public during the war. No medals were awarded, no speeches made. But within that hangar, in the quiet realization of German engineers, the outcome of the air war had already been written. The B-17 did not win the war alone, but it showed which side understood what modern war had become.